And we're live. It's Tuesday, October 15th, 2024, 5 o'clock p.m., and this is Dog Shirt TV. My guest today is the estimable Jordan Ellenberg, who is not just a Jew who controls the weather. He is the specific Jew appointed by the High Council of the Worldwide Conspiracy to be in charge of weather control. That's right. Jordan controls a worldwide team. It manages is a better word for it. He manages a worldwide team that decides where hurricanes are going to strike, how severe they're going to be, where we're going to have droughts, when the El Nino is coming, and all that jazz. We're going to talk to him about his routine of playing the Wisconsin university number theorist by day. But first, the monologue. I want to talk today about how to read polls. Don't. That's the answer. They're not important anymore. They're useful for trends. The relevant fact is that all polls within all swing states are within the margin of error. And if one strays outside of it, the next brings it back. According to the New York Times polling averages, of the 7 or 8 states that they're listing, or the 7 swing states, 6 of them have a margin for either candidate that is less than 1%. So that is closer to to dead even than to a margin of error race. And therefore you should just ignore the polls and assume that whatever is happening, we have no the matter is within your agency to the extent you're politically involved. It is not something that is in any sense determined by any of these polls. Not, by the way, that the polls ever determine the race, but you can fool yourself when somebody's like 8 points ahead. You can say, well, there's no point in getting involved because my efforts are not worth 8 points. And that's probably true. However,
ask Susan Collins.
Yes. However, sometimes the margins are much closer than that, and your efforts actually matter. And this is one of those times in all of the relevant states. Therefore, stop hitting refresh on 538 or on the silver, whatever he's calling bulletin, or on Decision Desk HQ. Stop doing it. Look at it once a day if you must, but don't do it more than that. And just get out there and do the work. And you know what the work involves. It involves spending money. It involves calling people. If you're Ukrainian, by the way, and you're watching this, call your friends and family in Pennsylvania. There's a super disturbing story in the Washington Post this morning by my old colleague Josh Rogan about Ukrainian voter sentiment in Pennsylvania. Go out, call your friends and say, Dyakuyu, but screw your head on straight, okay? Just do it. And then, I am thinking about things that, like field trips that Lord and Lady Laser and I might take over the next few weeks. Certain overhangs, bridges over roads in Pennsylvania, that sort of thing. Think about things that you can do, areas you can add value. And now let's talk about controlling the weather. Jordan, when we were young children, oh, sorry, you were about to say something.
I was just, it is my job to control the weather, but I don't want to let it go by that the comment was also me. Our usual comment guy was off this week and he's been doing nothing. So I just, I felt like I had to show, you can actually bring a comment once in a while.
That's right.
Wasn't quite authorized to do that.
But is our comments outside? They're your jurisdiction. They're not in your jurisdiction, right?
It's a different it's a different subcommittee.
I see.
I'm not strictly on, but
I want to understand how you got into this. When we were children, we had this game where I don't remember how it started, where we would point at places on the map and zap them. And then in the context of this game, they would turn into lakes. And we called it sinking places. Do you remember this?
I remember it. I'm trying to imagine what your audience is now imagining our childhood must have been like, based only on this one data point.
Right. Well, I mean, there are some other data points, but they're no less peculiar. And my question is that how you got into controlling the weather by, as a child, sinking states and countries?
It was probably more of a premonition than a direct causal link. And again, for our younger listeners, I mean, it should be said that Ben and I grew up in a time when countries actually sinking was a rather fanciful concept instead of like a literal projection of current
Right.
trends. So
We weren't thinking about the Maldives.
yes, it was a bit more lighthearted at the time than it sounds now.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. I still think of it and as, you know, it was like a childhood exercise of power. We would point at a map and it was like, Kentucky. And then it's a lake.
And
Um,
again, I want to emphasize that I think the point was not uh, to sort of hostilely overrun the inhabitants of a certain country with water. It was more just like what would make an interesting looking map
yes. But
with with a
but I
country
do
shaped
but
lake.
wait
It's
a minute.
really
There
aesthetic.
was a slightly coastal elite vibe to it because we never pointed at coastal states and sunk them. It was always like about creating lakes in the middle of land masses.
Well, that's right, because you can't create a lake by sinking Maine. It just means there's less Quebec, basically.
Right, exactly. All right. So this has started in a strange direction, but my question is, how did you go from that to controlling the actual weather and deciding that, for example, Western North Carolina was going to become a lake?
Well, you have to work your way up, as in any industry. You start with like very small uh, local anomalies. And I promise that, the Sanhedrin are not going to give you the keys to the lake knob until you've really proven your mettle for like a long time in lesser activities.
Yeah. So I mean, and Jordan's latest book does tell the story of these lesser anomalies that he caused. I think it's called The Shape of the Water Body. So go look for that on Amazon. Um, Jordan, let's talk a little bit about your day job when you're doing your Bruce Wayne as opposed to sinking countries and regions of the country. Um, you are a mathematician, or you pose as a mathematician at the University of Wisconsin, and uh, and you uh, have um, a very unusual viewpoint that I have not seen any counterintuitive Slate articles about, or which is that undergraduates are delightful and that the kids are fine. And so I want to ask you about this because everywhere I turn, there's all of these fretful articles about the kids aren't all right, and by the way, the parents aren't all right either, because we're so worried about the kids that now it's bad for parents' health. um, and you're a college professor and you've seen generations now of 18-year-olds matriculate to the University of Wisconsin and graduate, and you're pretty complacent about the kids. So, what's going on? Are you just getting soft, or is everybody else in a moral panic?
Oh, I think I was always soft. But no, I mean, it's true. I've been doing it for 20 years. For the last couple of years, I've been teaching a freshman seminar. So I see kids right when they get to college, right? I see them first semester, freshman year. They're 18, they're 19. And I'm teaching this course called Writing in Data. It's mostly data science majors, data science, a little bit of computer science, a little bit of economics. I'm teaching them about how to write effective English prose but then makes a quantitative argument, which is not so easy to do, right? It's easy to sort of write something that looks like a spreadsheet that you put in the form of a paragraph. So there's really specific, on the one hand, there's very specific challenges there. On the other hand, a lot of it is just what you would tell any college freshman about how to write. We read this. Did you know this Janet Malcolm essay, 41 False Starts, which is such a beautiful piece. And we always like, I mean, it's sort of her version of attempting to write a piece with 41 proposed openings to this essay she's writing about this painter. And it's a very beautiful exercise in sort of how to open a piece. So we read that and we talk about it. And what I want to say about my students is that somehow this whole thing about how students can't read, I don't really believe it because I see them read, the students at the University of Wisconsin. Like, when you ask them to sort of read a piece carefully, think about the choices of words in it and the sentences in it and what's working, and what's not, they can really do it. And I find it extremely heartening. I mean, there's really sort of, you know, let me zoom out a little bit. You talked about not obsessively doom scrolling, refreshing, reading polls. God help us, even worse, reading commentary about polls and then commentary about that commentary. If you're online all day, there's something extremely healthy and refreshing to the soul to being in a room with a bunch of 18-year-olds who are capital NLT not like that. They're just normal and they're sort of thinking about their normal things. And we're talking about the things that college is supposed to be about, how to put words together into sentences that sound good and can be read, and how to put those sentences together into paragraphs that sound good and can be read. I mean, I know this is making me sound like a sort of gruff old conservative, but we kind of are in universities pretty conservative. We're like doing the same old things because they're important things to do. And students, I have found, still want to and are able to do them.
Yeah, so I have had very similar experiences teaching writing about law, which I do periodically at I've done at a few different law schools, um, and my experience of it is, first of all, the idea that the Utes are illiterate is wrong. Some of them, there's a bell curve of their writing. The best are incredible. The worst are probably not signing up for my class or yours, just judging from, but they're the bad end of the tail is bad. And the huge bulk is in this middle lump, as bell curves are, that is quite adequate and, more importantly, infinitely trainable. And I am, I don't walk in with the expectation that people are, writing, Jonathan Swift essays or George Orwell essays, but I'm not seeing people who can't string sentences together.
Right. And this thing about being trainable or teachable, I mean, I think the most hyperventilative pieces that I read, they're not just saying that kids are coming in with fewer skills than we might want. They're saying that they're seeing, in their view, college students today kind of don't even understand what they're being asked. Like, they depict this story where you ask a student, okay, what do you think of this book we read? And they sort of stare at you blankly as if you've asked, like, what did you think of that cuneiform papyrus that, oh no, wait, cuneiform wouldn't be on a papyrus, would it? Well, whatever, sort of something old and impossible and outside their
I think
ken. I mean,
cuneiform's mostly on big rocks.
yes, I think if you tried to cuneiform a papyrus, it would just rip into tiny little papyrus shreds. But the point is, I just think there's this kind of alienation from the entire academic project that I see described constantly, to the point that it's become conventional wisdom. And at all kinds of, it's people from all kinds of universities who report it. So I don't know if they're teaching different classes or if they just experience the whole enterprise in a different way than I'm seeing it.
Do you think part of the explanation is that they maybe overvalued the literacy and capability of their own cohort?
Well, let me say one specific thing, because there's one specific thing that I do not ask and that I see like very central to this complaint, is that people say they can't get students to like read a whole book in a week. And I don't ask my students to do that. That's just not the nature of my thing because we're doing close reading. So I would ask them to read like an essay, sort of like a 20 or 30 page essay and read it and think about it for a week. So it's true that the one thing I will say is I do not have this experience of what happens if you ask a student to read a whole book. Are they capable of doing it? But I talk to my students about the books they read, so I know that they do read books.
I mean, I have to say, I read very slowly and always have, unlike you, who I used to watch reading at a pace that was probably 3 or 4 times what I could read. And, um, you know, when I would have to read a book very quickly, uh, I would more or less have to fudge it. Not because there aren't books I can read in a week, but because there's a certain thickness beyond which it's not happening in a week. At least not if I mean to retain any portion of it. And so, like, I think the assumption of people who are, assigning books that when they were students, um, all of their colleagues, all of their cohort actually did the reading. Like, what fantasy planet are they living on? I don't know. Um, anyway, all right, let's talk about the election in Wisconsin.
That's where it's happening.
Yeah, that does seem, well, it seems to be one of the places. And so you have been involved over the years in a whole lot of efforts to think about redistricting. And none of them is relevant to the question of the current election because it's statewide, right?
No, I wouldn't say that at all, actually. I would say that because you got to remember the fact that we have, at long last, after a sort of 12-year political and legal battle, now have fair maps in the state of Wisconsin. We have completely redrawn state legislative maps that are not gerrymandered to high heaven like the old ones were. I would that means that there's more competitive races. So there's more, to the extent that people care about their state legislator at all, which in Wisconsin I think they do more than most places, just because it's been a politically active state where the state legislature actually does stuff that people notice, for better or for worse. I do think it affects people's willingness to show up for the election, the fact that control of the state legislature is not a foregone conclusion the way it has been in previous years.
That's super interesting. And is that just a hypothesis, or is there any empirical support for it beyond a sort of instinct that it makes sense?
It is a hypothesis that I just made up in the moment because you said that the new maps have no impact on a statewide race. And I
I
thought
see.
to myself, is that really
It's
true?
my
And it's not
favorite kind of
obvious that there's no
hypothesis.
impact.
The impromptu hypothesis because a camera is pointed at you and somebody says
Yeah.
something provocative. All right, so let's talk about Wisconsin and math. How does a mathematician in the state of Wisconsin look at this race in a fashion that is different from anybody else who cares about the race?
That's a great question. I would like to think that we have some ability to be like a little bit more principled in certain ways. Like I'll give an example. I think you're absolutely right to say at this point in the race, there's probably not very much to be gained from staring at polls, refresh, refresh, refresh. Partly because this is a somewhat unusual race, and that they're sort of all changing saying the same thing, and what they're saying is not changing very much. So there's sort of not a lot of dissensus among pollsters about what's happening. But I want to emphasize that the fact that um, those polls are showing an essentially tied race, a less than 1% margin in all of these swing states, should not be read as the polls predicting that the race is going to be close in all those states. It very well might not be. What it's saying is that you really shouldn't think that either side has an advantage. And there have been a lot of very close statewide races in the state
And
of
just
Wisconsin.
for those who are not, so this is a super important point. But for those for whom it is not intuitively obvious, what is the difference between saying it's a 50-50 race and saying the result is going to be extremely close?
I think you should read a 50-50 race as saying that neither side has a strong advantage. And, it's just as likely or roughly as likely that Kamala Harris wins our state by 3 points as it is that Donald Trump wins our state by 3 points. But either of those things is certainly very plausible, even though, as it happens, the last two presidential elections in Wisconsin were decided by a margin much narrower than that. But there's no reason to be anything like certain that will happen again. We'll see when we see.
Yeah, so I think see if I'm being imprecise in how I characterize this, but it seems to me what the polls are saying is that Kamala Harris will get somewhere between 49 and 52% of the vote, or maybe as much as 52, as low as 47. Donald Trump will get as much as 52 and as low as 47, and that means either side can win. But if Kamala Harris gets 52 and Donald Trump gets 48, which is well within what the poll would contemplate, that's not a particularly close race.
Yes, although again, if that were the national totals, it would sort of depend how things were distributed among states. And sort of the big question
No,
that
no,
sort of
no. I'm talking about the state of
in
Wisconsin
Wisconsin,
here.
just in Wisconsin, okay. Yes, that would be by Wisconsin standards certainly much less close than most statewide races that we've had lately.
All right. So, what else, when you look at national discussion of the race, do you look at as a mathematician and say, if people knew how to think a little bit more like mathematicians, they would stop making this sort of mistake?
It's a great question. So first of all, partially it depends on what you count as a mistake. So for instance, there's a huge amount of discourse about the Electoral College that is completely absurd, right? Sort of people making their maps and say, like, we need the Electoral College so that, this like tiny parcel of acreage like can't rule over like this much larger parcel of acreage like that. But I'm not even sure I would count that as a mistake, because I think the people who say stuff like that don't really think they're making an argument. They're just trying to be tangentious, right? It's like hard to imagine that people really believe that acres should vote.
Right, but it's not. I mean, I think the no. So I'm not thinking about willfully tendentious
Right.
arguments. I'm thinking about um uh it, unintentionally glib assumptions that more basic numeracy would give you an instinct against.
Well, let me give you another one. I think there's a way of thinking, and I'm thinking back about Wisconsin politics, because you'll see a lot of discussion saying, like, well, in Wisconsin, there's Madison, which is the city where I live, and Milwaukee, which is the other big city in Wisconsin. But it's like really a red state. If you take those two places out, it's a red state. And I think the reason I think that's a
But that's
quantitative
true of
mistake is,
every state.
well, right. So the point is that
I mean,
it
if
is
you
the
take New
case.
York City out of New York, it's a red state.
And if you take rural New York out of New York, it's a blue state, right? I mean, it's an absolute fact that in any reasonably closely divided state, if you take the most Republican part out, what's left is pretty Democratic. And if you take the most Democratic part out, what's left is Republican. But I feel like people really find that compelling for some reason, that what a state really is what happens if you take a certain part out.
Well, so this is actually a really interesting point, that there's something about, if you take out the Democratic parts, you're taking out a small amount of land in every state, because rural America is Republican and vice versa. And if you take out, and there's some sense that the authentic large swath of America is conservative, and there are these geographic blips that are liberal. Whereas if you say, well, if you just get rid of the rest of Wyoming and, Dane County and Milwaukee, they're it's a very democratic state. That sounds ridiculous, because getting rid of the rest of the state is like, But I guess my question about that is, isn't that just another way of saying that land votes?
Well, but I think, let me put it this way. You could also say if you took Waukesha County, which is a sort of quite conservative set of suburbs of Milwaukee, if you took Waukesha County out of Wisconsin, that's also a pretty small space, and Wisconsin would be a safely Democratic state if we did that. And that's also a small piece of land. But somehow that's not thought of as a sort of anomalous piece of land.
Right, and
Um,
so I guess it's an interesting question. Why are Democratic areas thought of as anomalous pieces of land? And one possible explanation is racism. One possible, but that's a less has less explanatory power in Wisconsin than it does in some other places.
why would you say that? I think it has more explanatory power in Wisconsin than in other
Well,
places.
I mean, I don't think of Madison, Wisconsin as I mean, it's primarily defined by uh, youth and students and university life, right?
Well, that's your coastal media presence talking. I mean, Madison's demographics are pretty close to that of the whole United States.
Okay, so let me
I
put.
think actually that's probably something that most people. I mean, look, I'm from the same town that you're from. I come from the East Coast. I barely knew where Wisconsin was before I moved here, and I don't think that people have that close up a view of like what Wisconsin actually looks like.
So let me frame it a little bit differently then. One explanation is racism. Another explanation is historic. I mean, it dates back to Jefferson and Hamilton, historic suspicion of urban centers and commercial activity by yeoman farmers, right? And I think these, like, if you listen to the way that the Jeffersonians wrote about the Federalists, it sounds an awful lot like the way, you know, if you just got rid of Dane County, Wisconsin would be a conservative state, right? And so my question is, do you think that um, do you think that there's an overriding explanation for this prejudice, or do you think it's just a huge mixed cause thing that authenticity lies in the land and not in cities?
I think it's definitely both the things you say, maybe the second even a little bit more. But I also think that Wisconsin at its best, I mean, it's a wonderful state and with a tradition of good government, lately dinged a little bit, but it's it's a wonderful state in that there are cities, but the cities are not very far from the non-city. Right? You're never like in New Jersey where you could just drive and drive and drive and like not be in an urban agglomeration. Like anywhere you are in Wisconsin, you're pretty close to not being in a city. What's more, you're also never very far from being in a city, because the other thing about Wisconsin politics that I think uh, from a quantitative basis people miss out on, and they really think that outside of Madison and Milwaukee, um, it's ruby red. It's pure Republicanism. And that's very far from the case. There are lots of smaller cities in Wisconsin, and they're all pretty Democratic. Oshkosh is Democratic. Wausau is Democratic. La Crosse, Kenosha, Racine, Green Bay. All those places are full of Democratic voters. And I'm not sure, those are pretty smallish cities. Like, I don't really think they sort of violate the Jeffersonian creed. If anything, they're sort of exactly what you would think of as
Mm-hmm.
Americana. And those are Democratic places. Like any place people like live even moderately close together in the state of Wisconsin is a Democratic place.
All right, Richard, the floor is yours.
Hi, Richard.
Hello, am I not estimable today?
Oh, you are always estimable. I never use estimable in the second person. So hello,
Oh,
Richard.
Should
The
we
floor
estimate
oh,
is
you?
okay.
yours. Doesn't get estimable. But
Uh,
if I were to say, we are joined by the estimable Richard Wattenbarger, to whom I hereby turn over the floor, then there would be an
okay.
estimable.
Boy, I feel like I dodged a bullet there. All right. Um, So I have two questions about a question. And so, and you can answer the question if you want, but it's not really as important as the questions about it. So the question that I have the questions about is, have the polls gotten worse, like more accurate, less informative, or whatever over the past 2 or 3 decades? So that's the question that I have the questions about. Now, the questions are, first of all, why would or wouldn't that be a worthwhile question? And secondly, how methodologically speaking, um, would it make sense to go about investigating that?
So I take it first.
Yes, by all means.
I mean, you can certainly imagine an explanation for the polls being worse if they were worse, which is that those people don't answer their phones and it's hard to get people. And it is certainly an empirical fact that response rates are now like much lower uh, than they were, and people have to resort to sort of like all kinds of correction terms to try to account for the fact that they're not really able to get anything like a random sample of people anymore because they're getting a very small percentage of people even to respond to polls. That said, just like looking at the last few cycles, like I don't feel like election outcomes. I mean, I've not done a detailed study of this, but just in my gut, it doesn't feel like election outcomes are like radically farther from what polls predicted. It seems like election outcomes kind of look like the way polls do in general, and there's like some misses, but you would expect there to be some misses, and it doesn't. I mean, just as somebody who can't help myself by refreshing a little bit every 2 years, that I don't really remember being like shocked. Certainly not like, more shocked than in the past. So I think like somehow these like very quantitatively literate professionals are like managing to do their job under difficult circumstances, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, but it's more art than science, honestly. So if you were doing a scientific, like what percentage of the population is infected with the blank virus, right? You could go identify a random sample that was, and you could draw their blood if they would let you, and you could test them, and you could find out something like within a margin of error a response to that. But this is a little bit different from that because you're trying to predict future behavior. And even though polls say it's a snapshot in time, their accuracy is measured by how well they predict future behavior. So it isn't really a snapshot.
Well, that's a very interesting question, Ben, because you can ask, in the end, do you judge a poll by what it was saying all along, or do you judge it by what it was saying literally the day before the election, when presumably it is trying to judge behavior
Well,
right now?
except that if you don't do the latter, you have no way to measure its accuracy along the way.
Yes, and there's an argument that that's actually unmeasurable. That's what I'm saying. Some
Right. No,
people would
no,
say you
but
actually
I
can't
think
measure
it is unmeasurable,
it.
right? Whereas the question of what is the prevalence of malaria in Kenya is measurable. It's just
So actually, as somebody who, when I was an undergraduate research assistant, actually had the job of like reading a lot of papers about prevalence of malaria and trying to put it into a scientific model, it turns out that's actually pretty unmeasurable. And it's extremely hard to do that. And if you're like, who can I get to give me a piece of their blood? That's also not a random sample. And you also have like a very low willingness rate. And it's extremely hard. So I'm actually not sure that's any better.
So fair enough. But we can all think of if malaria in Kenya is not a good example. There are we know, for example, that there is more measles than there used to be in the United States, right? And
Right.
there are ways within certain margins of error that you can measure that stuff. Now, the problem with polls in a political environment like this is, I don't need to take a poll to know that Donald Trump is going to get 47% of the vote, at least. He's not going to get more than 50.1% of the vote. So you don't need a poll to say Donald Trump's going to get somewhere between 47 and 50% of the vote. And by the way, that difference is within the margin of error of any poll. So without doing any of the work, you can get a, a reasonable approximation of the answer. Because we're in a highly polarized environment, and 45% of the electorate is there for the asking for the Democrat, 45% is there for the asking of the Republican, and most of the rest aren't going to show up.
I mean, you say that, but at the same time, there are certainly races, for Senate, for House, there are certainly for Senate races are a good example. There are certainly Senate races in close states which are won by wide margins. So we
Yes.
know that there is actually a pretty substantial proportion of voters who, they may be in that 45% who are always going to vote one way for president, but maybe they're not. I mean, certainly because they're presented with the right Senate candidate. A lot of people in Maryland are going to vote for Larry Hogan for Senate.
Right. So let's take the Senate numbers. I can make up within a reasonable margin of error what Larry Hogan's result will be. He'll get 42%. Now, is that going to be exactly right? No. Is it going to be about what you would anticipate by studying the polls really carefully? And where does that number come from? It comes from it's a Democratic state. He's a Republican, and he's not going to get a lot of Democrats. And by the way, it's in a presidential election year, so his numbers will be a little bit suppressed because everybody's turning out, or maybe so. It's like 45% minus, basically. Now you can do, and then you can say, well, what about North Carolina? Well, that Robinson guy is freaking crazy. So, or drop him down to 38. But you don't really need polls to now. Would my information, would my predictions be a little more accurate if I looked at even one of them? Yeah, but the basic structure of a polarized environment gets you a large way to the answer, particularly in the presidential space.
I think particularly in the presidential space, but I definitely feel like, for instance, in Wisconsin's 3rd district, that's a House race in kind of the only swing House district that Wisconsin has. It's been very lightly polled, and as a result, I actually don't feel like I have a very strong sense of what's going to happen in that race. You have
okay, but let's talk about that. I know nothing about this race.
Okay. Very interesting race, actually.
So, when you say you don't know what's going to happen, what's the lowest number that a Democrat will get in that race?
I would say, to my mind, and by the way, the limited polls we do have show a close race, but it wouldn't shock me if either candidate won by 10 points in that race, which is a pretty wide range.
Okay, that's a reasonably wide range. Name another race that you feel that way about.
How about, okay, now I'm guessing because I know Wisconsin politics better than I know other politics, but what about the Osborne-Deb Fisher race for Senate in Nebraska? That's one that's kind of a wild card. You have somebody who's not in a party, and it's very hard for me to read exactly how that one is going to go. And that's also fairly lightly polled. And if it had been polled every freaking day, like Pennsylvania, I'll bet I would have a stronger sense.
So I agree with that. And yet the things that are polled
Am I showing you I read too many polls, Ben? I feel like I've tipped my hand and show you I...
No. I'm not surprised. Look, I think the fact that you can name 2 races that you're genuinely unsure about. And when I say unsure, I don't mean unsure who's going to win. I mean unsure about kind of what the range of reasonable possibility is, suggests to me that my broader thesis is right, which is that if you that we're over indexing on polls, and if you look at relatively, we all know roughly what Colin Allred is going to lose by in Texas, and we all know that he's going to do better than what's her name in Florida, and who's going to lose by more. And we all know.
I know that, by the way. That's more than I feel like I know.
You don't?
I feel less certain about that. Not that I'm saying you're wrong. I'm just saying I don't feel that confident.
I mean, I sort of feel like the part that you can just kind of look at the situation and have a very strong instinct about. And by the way, you're gonna
Okay, but let me say this, Ben. I feel like you're saying this. You can't unknow what you know. So you're saying this in an information environment in which you are, in fact, hearing about polls every day. And I just invite you to imagine the following thought experiment where if there was no such thing as a poll, um, and you were just watching on TV the two current candidates for the president of the United States, and I'm not going to say anything about any candidate because I'm still a state employee until 5 o'clock, so I'm not, but let me just say this: you're just watching these two people on TV. Would you be like, well, I know America, so I know that there's no chance that these people both seem like the people who think of themselves as members of that party will definitely stick with this candidate. Like they seem like a sort of normal representative of their party who people will absolutely 100% stick with. Do you really feel like you would know that if all you were doing was watching the current candidates on TV and you'd never seen a
well,
poll?
wait, we have to figure out what I don't know, right? Do I not know that Donald Trump won narrowly in 2016, lost narrowly in 2020 with a relatively small shift in votes in the same state?
I'm
Do
going
I
to
not
grant you
know?
that because that's not a poll. That's an actual election result.
So I get to know all election results?
Yeah.
And do I get to know the fact that I get to know all the primary results, right? So that he's nominated, notwithstanding repeated indictments, that he trounces Nikki Haley, that he, that all these viable, I know that the party's organized behind him. I would
Sure.
say he walks in with 45% of the vote. Absolutely.
So would you have said if there was no such thing as a poll in 2012, would you have said that Barack Obama, who won like a massive landslide in 2008, would like run like a very close race where he like almost gets beat by Mitt Romney? I mean,
Well,
if
he
what you had to
didn't
go by was
almost
just the
get
previous,
beats. He ran. Um, we thought it was close, and then it wasn't.
but
And
it was not 2008. It was nothing like the 2008 map.
no, he had a few fewer. I mean, he lost North Carolina, but he won the others. All the other states he won.
I don't think he
Look,
won Indiana in 2012. We could look it up.
yeah, that's right. He Indiana and North Carolina dropped off, but he basically held the same. Look, I mean, I'm not saying there's a level of precision that these polls give you, and they give you a sense of um you wouldn't without the polls you wouldn't know which the swing states were. You would only know which the swing states had been. Um And so, for example, you would not know that North Carolina is in play right now, but for a whole lot of polling in North Carolina that shows it's in play. You wouldn't know that Georgia and Arizona are harder for Kamala Harris than they were 4 years ago for Biden without polling that shows that. But would you know which states? Would you know the national picture? I think you would.
Well, part of the complication is that because of the bizarre shenanigan that is the electoral college, like we could know very firmly, okay, there's a floor of 47% for each candidate, and it could still be the case that like one candidate was very strongly favored to win the election, and we wouldn't know that unless we knew that detailed stuff about state by state. But that's just because of sort of the bizarre way we happen to set things up in this country.
Right. Now,
um but no, but your point, okay, it's funny because I find myself being in the position of poll defender, which in general, I'm not. If anything, I feel like, but you are such an extreme advocate for the uselessness of polls, and I find myself being
well,
on the
I'm
other side
not
that I usually am.
I'm not an advocate for the uselessness of polls. I'm an advocate for the uselessness of polls for the purpose to which we put them. I think they're super useful for things like do certain messaging strategies work, right? You're Kamala Harris and you want to try 5 themes. Doing focus groups and polling on those themes makes a lot of sense to me. I'm not sure, and also similarly, whether certain things are resonating that you are doing. I'm fine with a basic horse race poll occasionally. It seems to me saturation polling of individual states in a fashion that is, by the way, like very hard to falsify. Um, I'm not sure what value that's contributing.
Well, let me say a few things about that. One, I do think the point you make is very good, that when we say useful, there's a question of useful for whom. Useful for candidates, I would say definitely yes. Useful for people who are professional campaigners and like run state Republican and Democratic parties, I'd say definitely yes. But we are not them.
Right. What is the
When you say is it useful
average
for the uses
person?
that most people put them to, the average person, the use that we're talking about is the use of assuaging your anxiety. And is it working for that? No, people are like pretty fucking anxious. If you have not noticed, it's obviously not working for that for
Right.
that purpose. But I will say, let me give kind of like a slightly dark turn, which is that in the same way, I'm going to put on my like gruff old conservative man hat again for a second, if that's all right. In the same way that people are ruining sports by betting on it too much. Can we agree on that? That it's like there's people are too obsessed with like their complicated systems of parlays and like watching a bunch of football games in order to hope that like the tight end on one team makes 10 more yards and the quarterback on the other team throws 3 more interceptions instead of actually watching the game. I'm very crusty about this. I think there is actually, and sort of sadly, a growing market of people who have a gambling problem and bet on everything, including elections, and they are using the polls. I think they are the market in a lot of ways. And I think it's like very disturbing that people are seeing our elections as just another opportunity for a parlay. But I think there is a growing population of people who are doing exactly that and spending real money on it. And I think that's for them. I think it's an interesting question whether polls are useful or not.
And so, what do we think then of things that are not themselves polls, but that are aggregations of polls or models that are based on the sort of derivative application of polls? I have very mixed feelings about. I mean, this is the field that Nate Silver pioneered, but that lots of others have caught on to. And with 100% consistency, to my knowledge, they all end up providing a single percentage number that is way too way too precise, given it has too many significant figures for the degree of precision of the measurements. So we've taken like a bunch of polls with 3% margin of error, and we've reduced it to a 52% chance that so and so is going to prevail in such and such state. And it seems to me to be kind of like there's something to it, but it's also kind of fraudulent.
I mean, look, like I'm a mathematician. I'm never gonna not find the spurious third significant digit to be a cancer on our society. I mean, that's just who I am. But I'm not gonna get people to stop saying exponentially for anything that grows quickly, and I'm not gonna get people to stop putting that third significant digit. It's a lost battle. I understand that. I do think, though, that some form of aggregation. I mean, it's what we do with all information placed before us. We aggregate information from a bunch of sources and try to sort of get some picture of what's going on. And you can do that more formally and mathematically, the way that Nate Silver does, or you can do it casually. But either way, you're doing it. And what I will say, I mean, let me stick up a bit for Nate Silver on this, because what I like about him is that from the very beginning, he said, I'm not some kind of mathematical or statistical genius. What I'm doing is
I'm a
kind of the only
sports
thing
bettor.
he's like, I'm doing kind of the only thing you could do. And if somebody else wanted to do it, they would do it basically the same way and they would get basically the same answers. And that is indeed exactly what you see. If you look at all these sort of purportedly competing aggregators, they kind of are all getting the same answer, because Nate Silver does not have a secret sauce and has always said he doesn't have a secret sauce. So it is kind of this comical thing where I think because it draws clicks, like everybody's trying to do it, but it's kind of like everybody sort of trying to put up a page saying what time is the Super Bowl on, because you know people are going to search for it, and that's like, you know, you try to think of some way to differentiate so that when people search what time is the Super Bowl on, they click on your link instead of one of the other identical ones. But I think it's become like something like that, and it's hard to see why you should have a brand preference for 538 versus Silver Bulletin versus Economist's forecast or whatever else, unless you like the layout of one more than the other.
And is there, I mean, they all talk about it as though, and he says there's no secret sauce, but he also talks about the model as though it were a, you know, a person that's doing thinking, that's making assumptions, that, I mean, he sort of talks about it in a way that it creates a, an idea that it is an infinitely complicated processing of an enormous amount of data. Um, is your working assumption that basically what it's doing is it's looking at swing state polls and saying, you know, there's a 50-50 chance so-and-so is going to win this state. There's a 60-40 chance that so-and-so is going to win this state. And basically you do some multiplication and some addition, and it's very much like figuring out how many people are going to come to the wedding.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the dominant turn, and everything else is a correction. But the difference between my take and your take is that I don't think Silver tries to hide that. I think he's pretty open about that. And I would think quite on the contrary to this coming from some massive amount of data. I think the thing that makes it difficult is that there's actually a very, very small amount of data compared to any other scientific problem you might want to solve, right? Like
Right.
it's a
You
very
can't
small
fly a plane
problem.
through the eye of this hurricane.
Well, I control where the eye of the hurricane goes, so I can, because I control both.
Right, of course. All right, so we have 8 minutes to go, which means that if you have a question, this is kind of your last chance to get in. My last question, or last subject matter area is, if we were thinking about covering elections differently, I have a list of things that I would like to see people do. What are yours?
Well, I mean, this is one where I think what I'm going to say is like kind of conventional wisdom, so it's a boring thing to say, but sometimes boring pieces of conventional wisdom I kind of agree with and I think are basically correct, which is this phrase people are saying, you know, cover the stakes, not the odds. I do kind of believe in that. I fundamentally believe that there are real true differences between the two parties and the two candidates and how the country is going to be governed. And I'm not going to say that's not covered, but I think the ratio of that to horse race coverage. I mean, the horse race is a very good metaphor because not only is the election covered fundamentally as sports in many contexts, I think lots of Americans kind of see it as a sport. I'm not immune to it myself. You can sort of feel the same kind of parts of your cortex sort of lighting up that are activated when your team loses. If your team happens to only be able to score one run in 2 entire games of a wild card series, for instance, like you sort of know what parts of your brain activate when that kind of thing
And
happens.
why? Let's pause over that for a second. So, you know, one thing about sports, which is part of what makes them fun, is that there are no stakes unless
Exactly.
you bet on them. We got rid of
Betting is bad, by the way. But yes, carry
we
on.
got rid of gladiatorial competitions where there were stakes, but not for the audience. The stakes were for the competitors.
Right.
And the thing that makes sports is that the stakes for the audience are zero. The stakes in elections are usually reasonably modest. Should we have higher marginal tax rates or lower marginal tax rates? Should we have more or less generous social spending? But every now and then you have an election where the stakes are monumental. Should we continue to have a democratic system of government or not? Should we deport countless people who may have done nothing wrong or not? Should we withdraw from NATO and fuck the Ukrainians, or should we support, like, and so where do you think the psychological urge to process that in terms of sports and teams comes, rather than as a fight or flight instinct, right? There are many psychological instincts that you can map it onto. Why do we choose sports and teams?
I think first of all because sports are popular and like newspapers know how to promote things that are popular and are going to get people to read them. I mean, that's like a narrative that works for people and they understand it. I think it's probably mostly, and maybe because the very structure is that there are actually two teams. Like parties functions as teams, and I'm not historian enough to know whether parties function more like teams now than they did in the past. I kind of vaguely have that sense, but I'm not sure how right that is. It certainly does seem like the framers did not contemplate parties in the sense that we have them today, or else things would be organized a little bit differently. But I also think, let me say one thing about why it's so bad to treat politics as sports, because they're not sports. It's because in sports, look, we could be having an argument, and I could say to you, like, Derek Jeter sucked. He was like actually bad. He hurt his team. Now, we both know that's not true as a matter of objective fact. Yet I would say that, right? I've probably said the phrase Jeter sucks like 100 or 1,000 times in my life. And I can say that because the stakes are small. And we know that's a way that we talk
Exactly.
about sports. We kind of go overboard to support our team and slam the other team. And it's okay that we do that. It's like part of the way we engage.
And also, moreover, you can hold that idea in one side of your brain as a sacred truth, and also in the other side of your brain know that it's not true, and also know that if Derek Jeter walked into your front yard and knocked on your door, you would not greet him as an enemy, right? Those can all coexist in the sporting context, and they can't in the political context.
Right. And the problem is when I say to you, Jeter sucks, that's not a lie. It's some other kind of untrue statement. It's a statement, right? It's some other thing that I don't know if philosophers have a name for. But in the political context, it is a lie. If you're just like, I'm just going to say what supports my team and
they're eating the cats.
It's a lie and it's very bad. And so I think aligning that different. I mean, politics is not sports. I'm going to say it again and again. It's a mistake. It's always a mistake to make. Sometimes it's a worse mistake than others. I think now it's a pretty bad mistake to make.
Yeah, it's a pretty bad mistake. I will also just say on this point that one of the things about team sports is that when you are a fan of a team, you are a fan of the team even when the team is wrong. And I
For instance, you
remember.
think Jeter's home run should have counted in the 1996 ALCS, and you're wrong, but I respect that you think that.
I mean, look, the example that stands out to me is the famous pine tar incident, where every Yankees fan knew that we'd never heard of pine tar before, but we knew that what the right answer to that question was, and of course the fact that we would have been on the other side of that issue if roles had been reversed didn't matter a bit, and frankly shouldn't matter a bit. In the amount of pain that being never Trump causes for Liz Cheney is evidence of how destructive the team mentality is, that it's psychologically hard to break with your team. Now, she is enormously courageous and she's done it, but why is that even hard? And the answer is because we treat these things like teams. We treat these things like sports. We're going to leave it there because Dog Shirt TV, unlike In Lieu of Fun, begins on time and it ends on time. Jordan Ellenberg, you're a great American. And keep bombarding. Make sure those hurricanes only hit the parts of the country that are voting the wrong way. That's going to create an incentive structure for people to change their votes. And we're going to be back. We're going to be back on Thursday with Dave Wilner. Dave Wilner used to be the head of content moderation at Facebook, and then he ran content moderation for OpenAI. And he is going to explain to me why it is so hard for Facebook to acknowledge error in suppressing my letter to the now former Russian ambassador, Anatoly Antonov, who has been withdrawn, returned to Moscow, I think for failing to get special military operations against the embassy under control. I just made that up. That's okay. It's one of those things that exists in this part of the brain and in this part of the brain I know to be untrue, but it's so attractive to think of him as having been withdrawn to Moscow because of my light operations that I choose to do it anyway. Hey, stop refreshing the polls. It's just too close to do that. Chill out, have a drink.
Or don't chill out.
Or
Actually,
don't chill out, panic all you like.
Instead of clicking.
Just, but keep the faith. See you later, Jordan.
See you, Ben.